Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Donovan. We've all talked about strategy for many years, and lately a bit more about culture. So what's the difference between the two, and really what are people loyal to? Are they loyal to strategy, or are they loyal to culture? I think most of us know the answer to that question already. And we're very comfortable quantifying strategy and pointing to our strategies. But we get a lot less comfortable when we talk about quantifying culture. How do you track organizational culture? How can you nudge it? How can you make sure that your organizational culture aligns with your organization's strategy? Well, great news is there's a way to do that now, to quantify organizational culture. And that's what we're going to talk about today through something we call organizational culture harmonics. So very happy you can be with us, and I've got some great things to share with you. Let's jump right in. Strategy versus culture. I'm sure many of you have heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. There's a bit of a debate over where that quote came from, but many of us know what it entails. That culture is indeed a powerful influence on what happens in an organization or across a group of people. So when we think about organizational success, strategic planning still serves as a guidepost for much of that success. But you can't effectively execute a strategy in the absence of loyalty. Most leaders know how important loyalty is, and the members of the organization as well. That level of loyalty required is parallel to the scale of that strategy. The more visionary those strategic plans are, the more daring and bold they are, the more important it is to understand how much loyalty there is across your culture. That's because people are loyal to culture, not strategy. It's not that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's where the loyalty of people lies when they think about how they spend their time and energy as part of a group. So some pretty good quotes here that go all the way back to Cicero in the time of Rome, that there's nothing more noble or venerable than loyalty. And Abraham Lincoln reminds us that commitment, that loyalty to that commitment, is what transforms a promise into a reality. I love what General Colin Powell says when he discusses this. Loyalty means giving me your honest opinion. If I like it or not, that's not the point. It's good to disagree. It stimulates people. But once a decision is made, the debate's over. And from that point on, loyalty means executing that decision as if it were your own. So this discussion about what culture is and what strategy is really surrounds something we can think of as loyalty. Now, if we drill down a little bit further, here's your vision and mission. On the right in the light blue is a world that many of us are familiar with. Strategic planning, assessing your strategy, prioritizing objectives, developing the plan, executing it, going back and reviewing and revising it. On the left in the green is what we're only beginning to appreciate and understand in trying to achieve that strategy, and that's culture. You can think of culture as the assumptions, the values, and celebrations of a group of people. That's what drives it. That's the energy and power behind the organization. The direction, if you will, the navigation toward those performance outcomes is the strategy. So when strategy and culture are aligned, it's not one versus the other, it's their alignment. Culture plus strategy is what drives you to your actual outcomes. And now, when we pause and think about organizational culture, just like strategic planning, organizational culture can be measured. The relationship between culture and strategy is a powerful tool. Aligning culture and strategy provides power and direction. So like strategy, cultures too shift over time and change with conditions. We refer to this as a harmonic movement. So mapping these cultural shifts in your organization can be explored in what we're going to share next, organizational culture harmonics. When we think of strategy and culture, we're looking for those insights about how people function in a group that can help us better achieve the strategies that we've set within our organization. We refer to that as organizational culture harmonics. Harmony, when we think of harmony, that's a term that we usually associate with music or maybe some spiritual constructs. When systems are in harmony, they're thought to be more productive. Our lives are more peaceful. We often use the term balance or fulfillment. In this system, harmonics is a continuum, a range from consonance to dissonance. Consonance where things are working together and fitting together well, and dissonance where things are maybe a bit more disruptive. And in the middle of that continuum is a world that we can think of as the center. Organizational culture harmonics offers all stakeholders a powerful range of untapped data along this continuum so that individuals can see where they're at relative to the perceptions of the organization, and the organization can see the culture insights that they need to better achieve their strategic outcomes. So this is the system in a nutshell. We're quantifying organizational culture by looking at people's personal harmonic type. Those are attributes of the organization members. And then those members' perceptions of that organizational culture, the assumptions, the values and celebrations that create that particular group or create that organization. The PHT and the OHT is what we refer to them as. And then we conduct a gap. We look at a gap analysis between those individual characteristics and their perceptions of the organizational culture. We apply that data across something we call a harmonic scale, which drives you to a harmonic response. This is that field of psychometrics where quantitative psychology is used and applied to give information about those latent processes, how people think, how people feel, how they function as a group. And that is very powerful when you think about culture. That's going to get you a better understanding and insights on those shared assumptions, values, and celebrations to better prepare you for your strategic planning. Another way to look at this is to kind of back away and think of it a little bit like a golf ball or a baseball. So there's a core inside where individuals are well aligned with the overall culture of the organization. If you were to ask a leader, or most people know the people that are close to that leader and part of that leader's core. In any organization, they're typically the ones that are well aligned with what we keep repeating here, the assumptions, values, and celebrations of that group of people. Then there's another group outside that. They're not typically as maybe committed or active or as well aligned with that core strategy. They do believe in the overall mission and vision of the organization. They just might not be quite as passionate about it, but we call them participants. They're still participating in the core. Finally, we have outliers. Those are the individuals that are still part of that organization, but they may not be quite as aligned with those core assumptions. These are all important roles in the organization. There are no bad locations if you think about a continuum of people's passion. You need outliers to challenge your basic assumption. You need a strong core to provide continuity. And you need enough participants that you're all working toward a common objective to achieve the outcomes. That's what culture harmonics does, is it maps these individuals relative to your culture. Again, such a powerful tool when we think about strategic planning. A snapshot here of what this looks like from the quantitative side. People are loyal to this culture and not strategy. The field of psychometrics tries to provide objective measurement of things such as personality, attitudes, and beliefs, all of which are key aspects of culture. Organizational culture harmonics measures those personalities, if we like to call them that, they're characteristics of those individuals, and we calculate a gap analysis between their beliefs on the organization's culture and those preferences of those individuals. This is a Cartesian harmonic analysis, something that we've invented here, where we can get metrics and a dashboard that we can correlate to performance. It will show you, it will help you map right where your culture is, and then you look at your performance. Your culture may or may not be in the optimal position based on the goals of your organization. It's that quantification that holds all of that untapped potential to adjust to those external changing conditions. We all know that the outside world changes. It changes rapidly, sometimes quite extensively. And not only our policy and procedure needs to be prepared to adjust to that, but our culture as well. Little bit closer in, we're zooming in like we are in a magnifying glass. This system is grounded in 3 proven domains correlated with human behavior. The affective domain, how people feel, the cognitive domain, how people think, and the psychomotor domain, how people act. And we put these on an X, a Y, and a Z axis. That will yield 8 different types. So those 3 psychometric dimensions, we look at the level of how people feel and think and act based on the researchers that you can see here and that sound theory. And what we're trying to get to are those data insights that will show you how people move and shift over time. Unlike most personality theory that says, well, you're this type and you stay that type. That's not Cartesian harmonics. That's not organizational harmonics. You'll find that many people adjust their personalities based on work versus home versus hobby. So it's that change, that harmonic movement we need to better understand if we're building these ideal organizations. Next, we'll talk about personal harmonic type, the first step in the organizational culture harmonic system. The first phase of the organizational culture harmonic system is to gather information and quantify some characteristics of the members of the organization. We refer to this as PHT, or personal harmonic type. Your personal harmonic type is based on how you perceive your world, how you construct your world, and how you engage your world. Carl Jung is a well-known psychologist, particularly for his major personality type theory. He based his on 8 types, and what he emphasized was introversion and extroversion. Many of us are familiar and relate to that as an extrovert or an introvert. But we also realize that, hey, there are different times. I may be an introvert at work and an extrovert at home. And when we think about this and how people change, there are different ways to approach recording individual characteristics. What we've done here is create 3 basic questions. That's all we really need at the beginning to get those initial insights on your personal harmonic type. The full organizational harmonic system has a 30-item battery of questions for these domains with a lot greater accuracy. But when you're first getting into this, we can get to those characteristics pretty solidly with just 3 questions. We invented these imaginary characters called roos. Roos are just characters to represent each psychological type. They help us better understand each other, ourselves, and members of the organization, stakeholders as well. So the roos that you see on the right, and you've been seeing them peppered in the presentation all along, are actually those psychometric types. Remember, this is grounded in proven domains of theory within the psychometric instrument. But the fun part is right at hand. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and they're going to tell us which roo you are, and that's the beginning of our data analysis for organizational culture harmonics. The first question, in which roo are you? When you think of your world, how you see the world, which describes you better? Emotion or logic? Yeah, we all use both, absolutely. And certain days we're more emotional and certain days we're more logical. But think about your life overall. Would someone else describe you as an emotional person or a logical person? Would you describe yourself, which is more important here? Are you more emotional or more logical? So see the gauge on the right displayed here. That's not an either-or question in its entirety. Some people might be barely logical or barely emotional. So the vertical arrow that you see in the diagram, they would sort of move it to the right if they thought they were slightly logical, generally, heavily, or extremely. Move it to the left if they were barely, slightly, generally, heavily, or extremely emotional. So what I'd like you to do is just think of the letter, or you can certainly write it down, E or L. Are you, when you perceive the world, Do you do it more through emotion or you do it more through logic? You don't have to use the numbers here, but it's kind of fun to do that. Nobody is absolute dead centered in the middle and uses it 50-50. No matter how barely you might tilt either way or how significantly, use that 1 through 5 here, where E1 is barely, E2 is slightly, E3 is generally, E4 is heavily, E5 is extremely on the emotion side. And if you think you sort of tick to the logic side, barely logic, L1, slightly logic, L2, generally logic, L3, heavily logic, L4, and extremely logic, L5. I am probably an E4, if not an E5. I'm a pretty emotional person, but there are a lot of times I have to push myself to the logic side. I use logic like everybody, but I would describe myself as definitely emotional. So take a moment and record E or L. Okay, you've perceived the world. They've come in, all the input, all the stimulation through your senses. And I mentioned earlier, all learning is processed emotionally first. If I didn't, I should have. But it goes through something called the amygdala before it reaches the prefrontal cortex. So that as it gets to that prefrontal cortex, then cognition kicks in and we start to construct our world. We take all those things that we've perceived and begin to build what we think is an accurate reflection of reality. We do this on a scale of holistic, big picture forming meaning to detail, where we're forming that meaning based on the fine details or the detail. Some people like to think of this as I see the forest versus I see the trees. Are you a holistic person, a big picture person, or are you a detailed person? Again, you can use the gauge displayed here and ascribe a number to that. You might just be barely holistic, or you might consider yourself generally detailed. This is all based on your perception. So take a moment to write down H for holistic. I think most of the time in big picture meaning and looking at the world from high above is another way to look at it. Or, no, I'm a detailed person. I'm pretty skilled at things like spreadsheets or paying bills, or I'm terrible at those things, but that's okay. Everybody has a strength. H for holistic and D for detail. Last question. Now that you've perceived the world, you've constructed the world, you're going to engage the world. When you think about how you engage the world, which one best describes you? Are you an altruistic person or are you an individualistic person? Now, we all have forms of altruism. The psychological theory and the research on this is quite well grounded. We also have to look at our needs of ourself, those hierarchy of needs that we may have heard of. So it's not a bad thing to be on either side of this continuum, just like it isn't on the previous questions. But if you stop and think where you spend your time, where you spend your resources, how you engage the world, do you really look more towards the needs of yourself or more towards the needs of others? And you can put a number to it as well, as whether or not you're barely, slightly, generally, heavily, or extremely the altruistic individual or the individualistic individual. It's a little bit difficult to say, right? But it's an A or an I. Take a moment to write that down. So what you should have is your profile, your personal harmonic type, an E or an L, an H or a D, and an A or an I. Those are the three vertical squares that you see here. If you wanted to, you could also write the number, the level, or the degree that you think. You might have considered yourself an L3 and a D2 and an I4. Or you could have looked at yourself as an E1, an H3, and an A2. Whatever that is, those letters, we'll focus on the letters right now, tell us your personal harmonic type, grounded again in cognitive, affective, and psychomotor theory. So we're going to walk through these very quickly about which roux, which personal type you are, and the characteristics of those roux. Okay, We see our logical rules across the top. Our website has a lot more information on this. We have mind maps for each roux. We have, of course, the team formation, which ones, how you can manage different types, just like most psychological or psychometric instruments like this. And this will go much deeper, though, in terms of culture. So if you're an LDA, you are what we call a keeper roux. You're typically very dedicated to the organization. You're above average in perception. You're extremely reliable. And perhaps above all, I say above all twice, but you're very protective. The keeperoos are typically managers or leaders, whether they're formal or informal. Many times we find them at middle levels of management, but they could also be lower in the organization or higher. The key characteristics here, though, is that they're logical, detailed, and altruistic, and that altruism drives them to protect members of what we call the herd, which, if you put all these roux together, you get a nice herd. If you're an LHI, you're logical, you're holistic, you're individualistic, you are what we call a loyal roux. Trust is so important among the loyal roux. It drives that loyalty and that dependability, and therefore their productivity. Transparency is equally important to the loyal roux. In earning that trust, organizations must be transparent in how they drive policy and resources and watch for all the elements that would really move a loyal roux in or out of their core. If you're logical, detailed, and individualistic, you're what we refer to as a data roux. You're very focused in supporting your organization. You are extremely unbiased and honest and not afraid to say something that the data shows. That level of attention to detail is what drives your decision making, and you are compelled to share that and support the organization through that honesty. And LHA, the Visaroos, the logical, holistic, and altruistic individuals whose primary characteristic is courage. Very curious individuals, very courageous, typically very visionary, and very active and engaged in the organization. Your leader may or may not be a Visaroos. Many times the Visaroos are informal and they're peppered throughout the organization at department levels or even at entry levels. So this is not a hierarchy of leadership within an organization. These are the characteristics of individuals as you drill down to all levels of the organization. Next, we'll look at our emotional roux. The EDA, emotional, detailed, and altruistic, that's a morpho roux. Their flexibility, their versatility to adapt to whatever the organization needs is a key characteristic. They're very highly driven and will be willing to shift or change for that organization. And part of what really sets them apart is they're typically amazing listeners. They're phenomenal listeners. Morpho-roux are wonderful assets, as all these types are, to the organization. The Chipperoos are EHAs, the emotional, holistic, and altruistic individuals with their generosity, their enthusiasm, their just boundless energy. They're typically the volunteers of the organization. They're always chipping in. They're always willing to step up and do whatever's required next for the group. EDIs, emotional, detailed, and individualistic, are what we call wanderoos. Their level of intelligence and creativity is usually above, if not well above normal, but they tend to be nomadic. They can wander either within a department, from department to department, or even across organizations, people that come in and go, because they're looking for that fit. Someplace they've got to be certain is going to help grow their talent and to be a place where they can fit in well. That's a wanderer. And finally, the EHIs, the thriveroos, emotional, holistic, and individualistic. These are canaries in the coal mine. They're typically very honest, similar to the data-roos, but they're opportunistic, they're adaptive, and they're often deep thinkers. They'll challenge the organization and the organization's assumptions. Many times we see them as outliers that are asking the tough questions often. That's the thriveroo, but also extremely important to the organization. So we mentioned the Cartesian grid earlier. Each one of these types can be displayed mathematically on that grid. This is what we call the roux cube. They hold a statistical position within the identity matrix of their particular type. So all the emotional ones are on one side of these distributions, all the logic on the other, and it's across those three axes. And remember those levels. While there are 8 general types, there are literally 1,000 different points of data. And there are some boundary rules. We'll talk about that a little bit later to do something called a switch roux. Not everybody stays the same type of roux all the time. Like extroversion and introversion, they will shift some of their characteristics either for a task or because of personal situations. And it's those shifts in your ability to track them and quantify them over time that can give you tremendously valuable insights on the culture of your organization. The organizational culture harmonic system looks at the preferences or types of individuals and then asks them for their insights on their organizations. Those insights are what we refer to as an organizational harmonic type. This is the type of organization that the individuals think that they're a part of. Then we conduct what's called a gap. That's what we're going to cover in this section. Just like individuals, organizations perceive, construct, and engage the world. There's some really good theory out there, most of which you can find on the web pretty easily, about organizations having personalities or organizations having characteristics. Those characteristics are actually culture. That's the culture of the organization. I don't think of them so much as a personality as I do a harmonic type. So we can ask the same questions that we ask ourselves for our individual personal harmonic type and get some great insights to the culture of the organization. So that's what I'd like you to do here. If you're part of an organization or you lead an organization, if you're not, you can even think of your family if you choose to, because that is a group and there are family cultures. But we'll stick to the organizational perspectives here. Think about your place of employment and use the gauges to the right, the same way you did in your personal harmonic type, to respond to these questions. When your organization perceives the world, does it do it more through logic or does it do it more through emotion? Most people could tell you pretty clearly, yeah, we make decisions based on emotion. Or no, we make decisions based on data and logic. Well, when you ask a leader, that's one thing, as opposed to asking every member of the organization. That will give you a much more accurate perception of what that culture is. And here again, we use those levels or those degrees from 1 through 5. Do you think your organization is mostly emotional or logical? And to what degree? So an L1 would be barely logical, an L2 slightly logical, an L3 generally logical, L4 heavily logical, or an L5 extremely logical. The opposite of that would be, we're just barely emotional in E1, or we're kind of slightly emotional in E2. We make decisions generally emotionally in E3, or heavily in E4, and extremely in E5. So if you were writing this down, you would bubble it in, but you can just make a note on a scratch piece of paper here. How does your organization perceive the world, emotionally or logically, and to what degree? The second question. Your organization is perceiving the world through the data that it gathers, and it's creating policy and procedure and directing resources as it constructs the world. How does it do that? Does it do it more through its holistic, big picture goals, vision, and mission? Or does it look more at details and driving those decisions from very granular data? Hopefully, all organizations certainly are doing both. They have a broad mission and vision. They're gathering that data. But how would you, as an individual in the organization, or even a leader, say that your organization leans? Again, however, barely, slightly, generally, heavily, or extremely. Are you an H5, an H4, H3, H2, H1? Or do you think, nah, we're more on the other side of the scale here in the purple and orange? We're more on the purple side where we're barely a D1, or we're a D2, D3, D4, D5. This is how your organization constructs the world. An H or a D, and then the level. Okay, finally, the organization engages the world. Just like individuals, They'll direct their energy and resources either toward the altruistic service of others, whether those are customers or the community or students, or they'll do it individualistically and focus on themselves and their profit and the members of the organization. All organizations do both. Typically, there's a little bit of altruism, or there's whatever level of individualism, an A or an I. And again, here to what level? This is strictly your opinion of where your organization is across these three dimensions. And that, just like a personal harmonic type, creates an organizational harmonic type, of which there are 8 kinds. So here are the labels that we have for 8. Like Jung's 2 major groups of introversion and extroversion, you can think of organizations as passion and emotion-led or reason and logic-led. Of course, every organization uses both, but again, they're going to tip, however, slightly toward one or the other. If it's an EHA, emotional, holistic, and altruistic, we refer to that as a service-driven organization. They perceive the world emotionally. They don't always rely on their data. They might trust their intuition and their vision and their passion and really direct resources accordingly in their policies and their procedures. If they're an EDI, emotional, detailed, and individualistic, they also perceive it emotionally, but they tend to tolerate and even encourage failure as a strategy for growth. They're explorer-driven. You may have heard of Intel, the great chip manufacturing company. They used to put up these massive signs that said, "How have you failed today?" encouraging that failure as a form of exploration. If they're emotional, detailed, and altruistic, more focused outside, they typically value that adaptability to those outside changing conditions, whether it's a market or an altruistic nonprofit service area. It's that dedication to that external world that makes them better positioned to alter or shift or change their organization drastically, alter-driven organizations. EHI, emotional, big picture, holistic, individualistic. They treasure that healthy disagreement, and they'll encourage it, if not reward it. They like that dissent. They like those differences and those challenges. You won't find this led by what we often say is a yes management team that just support what the leader says without challenging it. Dissent-driven organizations thrive on that dissonance and that disagreement. Over on the logical side, an LHA organization is often idea-driven. They're applying that data through their logic and relying less on the intuition, and they're focusing on innovation and vision. They're idea-driven because they have that big picture, but they tend to they're going to back it up a lot more with data and less often trust their intuition or their feelings. An LDI, logical, detailed, and individualistic, is very, very, very data-driven. They're going to perceive the world logically, they're going to apply that data, and they're going to analyze it deeply, and they're going to base their policy and direct their resources toward that data-driven decision-making. They're usually very big on compliance. Consequently, equity and fairness are core values of these data-driven institutions quite frequently. Century-driven, logical, detailed, and out-focused through altruism. They perceive the world logically. They're deeply committed to commitment, that loyalty that we talk about a lot, to the outside community. So that creates something of a protector within them, like the Keeperoo. They're century-driven. They feel that they have a responsibility to protect either their customers or their students or their community or all of the above. And finally, the LHIs, logical, holistic, individualistic, are heavily trust-driven. They do a lot through transparency with their policies and procedures and the allocation of the resources and budget decision making. No illusions of inclusion here. You may have heard that term before, because they're after that longitudinal loyalty and that collegial respect and dedication to those core values. You can find out a lot more about these 8 different types at Culture Harmonics in our blog. So this is just a quick reminder to anchor us back to where we are so far in the organizational culture harmonic system. We're looking at member attributes, the personal harmonic type. We've just discussed the organizational harmonic type, the OHT. And next we're going to take a look at the gap analysis. what's the gap between those perceptions of the individuals and their preferences? And that's where the gap analysis begins. You can look at yourself as an EHA member or worker in an LDI organization. This is what the organizational culture harmonic system does. What you see right in front of you is it maps it. Here in the green is where the individual is in that Cartesian analysis. And then in the red is the OHT, their organizational harmonic type. They're depicted in red and blue in the upper right. It's like triangulation across that data, where they exist relative to their perceptions of the organization. So there's 1,000 different degree levels here. You can get very granular in tracking this across time and get some predictive analytics on your organization's performance and the placement or the harmonics of the individuals relative to their perceptions of that culture. This is what gives us those core, those participants, and those outliers. The gap or the distance between those is going to quantify the intensity of those differences or the level of those harmonics. And that's what this slide shows you. When we look at the quantitative analysis of culture, it's a tough thing to do. But here, what we've created is something that will help you make better decisions about your organization and its resources relative to the perceptions of the individuals. Critical here to state, it's not a satisfaction instrument. This is an alignment instrument. You can have people that have wide gaps that are perfectly happy. Think about those people who you might know who are outliers and love to go in a meeting and point out the differences or challenge someone's position. You've got to have people like that. Then you've got those people, remember the chipperoos, they just want to jump in and whatever needs to be done, they want to do it. These gaps are going to tell you, not just in terms of type who those people are, but those overall assumptions, values, and celebrations that should be connected back to your strategic plan. That's the gap that you're looking at here. So the gap between an E3 individual who thinks they're in an L4 organization is significant. The gap between that individual who labels himself as an H5 but is in a D3 is another significant gap. And finally, they see themselves as an altruistic 1, but their organization is individualistic 4. So their total gap value is 17. The total points they can get out of this is 30. So that as we norm all this statistical data down, we look at a deep gap analysis. And it's that gap analysis that's really going to become important for our next topic, which is culture mapping. Strategic planning is, again, a process that we're so very comfortable with in looking at setting our goals and the methods through which we're going to achieve those, measuring that and adjusting it and going back constantly. But as we've discussed in each of the sections here, that people are loyal to culture, not strategy. So you need to align your culture with your strategic plan through a process that we call culture mapping. The way that culture mapping works is in the previous sections, we walked you through how we look at a person's harmonic type, an individual. We look at their perception of the organizational culture, of what we call an OHT, and we calculate a gap with a value. And that value indicates where they are on the continuum of that cultural alignment, whether they're part of the core of the organization, aligned with the assumptions and the values and the celebrations, or whether they're a participant and they're still bought into this, but maybe not quite as active or aligned as someone at the core. And finally, an outlier, and they're not quite as aligned, but they serve a very, very important role in challenging the organization in terms of its not only its policy and procedure, but even its overall assumptions. These are all critical roles as members of the organization, and mapping how many you have of these types of individuals is as important as what you're doing with your strategic plan. That map, those gap scores, are going to tell you where your organization is as a whole, something we refer to as your organizational harmonic position. When we average all those scores, they're gap scores of the institution or the organization as a whole. Now, you can break these down by department or years of service, or group that data any way you want within the organizational culture harmonic system, but it's going to reflect these general observations across your entire culture. So when we look at those gap scores and average them all, if the average is 1 to 10, then it's going to reflect a consonant organization that's in harmony with most of the members. That consonant organization typically has a very strong and a very populated, vibrant core. If that score is an 11 to 20, we refer to that as a centered organization that's in harmony with many of the members. It typically has a robust layer of participants, a few good healthy outliers, and perhaps a smaller core. And finally, a score of 21 to 30 would indicate that that is a dissonant organization. It's actually in harmony with a minority number of its members and might even have a significant layer of outliers. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing. That may be where you want your organization to be. In fact, that may be where you're most productive with regard to your strategic plan. But recall that there are 8 organizational types, each moving back and forth across that harmonic continuum below. That historical data compared to your strategic outcomes is going to offer you so many insights about staffing, group distribution, budget allocation, stakeholder engagement. All of these are called harmonic responses that we're going to talk about next. So once you understand where your organizational culture harmonics is at, then you can better understand that ebb and flow of consonance and dissonance, because culture is always in a harmonic movement. Your culture is changing as your people change, as your services change, as your resources change. And that score is going to describe your organization from which you can make perhaps some better decisions. So if you think of that score of 1 to 10, the consonant organizations create comfort and security. They can also inhibit risk and creativity. Consonant organizations have to challenge themselves to move outside their comfort zones. Creating a little bit of dissonance and stimulating growth is a good thing. They have to pay close attention to their diversity as populations, not only in terms of the typical metrics we look at regarding equity, but also psychological types. They can tend to be homogeneous along many lines. Consonance can be a strength in uncertain times, but it can also be an undesired position to be at over time for the overall culture. A score of 11 to 20, those centered organizations typically live in a center world where they have a healthy level of diverse members, perspectives, and talent. It's an overall beneficial position to be over time, but part of the challenge in maintaining that state can lead to individual and systemic complacency. The organizations have to be vigilant in attracting and retaining elements of dissent as well as consensus. Mistaking balance as the center of a position is a dangerous fallacy, because the external conditions are always going to change. It may need you to temporarily embrace either more consonance or perhaps more dissonance based on those external factors. That's what organizational culture harmonics combined with your strategic planning is going to empower you to do. And finally, those organizations with significant ranges of the gap, 21 to 30. They perhaps more likely live in a dissonant world where disruption and tension are common. Prolonged occurrence of this situation isn't typically advantageous, but again, there's some benefits to it. Dissonance creates a chance to reflect on change. It typically stimulates creativity, fortitude, and courage as the organization and its members rise to challenges after challenge after challenge. Chaos stimulates and with adversity comes opportunity. The prolonged position in a dissonant organization can also erode and undermine your core and your energy and your resources. There is no one idea organization. It's the power of looking at this data as a whole that says, here's where we're at according to the members of our organizations, here's our strategic plan, and here's our performance. And leadership and the members of the organization and stakeholders should be looking at all that data. Again, mapping your culture and looking at it through the performance through your strategy. The organizational culture harmonic system has a dashboard. It's got a dashboard that as you gather data from individuals about their types and their perceptions, you can get that data reflected both graphically and of course in a spreadsheet format. That's going to help you in timing this management. We suggest that you do this quarterly. You gather those OHT, organizational harmonic position, and those insights in your organizational harmonic type quarterly. And we'll talk about this as a pathway or a plan. But what we wanted to show you here is that all of this functions in like many management dashboards, the quantification of culture and the quantification of performance. This is a snapshot of a very early prototype of the ongoing development of our organizational culture harmonics dashboard. Now, culture mapping. So that as the organization gets this data over time, then you get these very, very insightful and important histograms. You can aggregate this data either through years of service or department or salary range. There's a lot of different ways we can work together to break it down. But ultimately, what you're looking for are strategic planning adaptations to either your distributions regarding equity, your team formations, your department analysis indicators, policy changes, budget, your engagement of external stakeholders for clients, customers, and students, however you want to do this. So what you can see here in the snapshot in the lower right is that a quarterly distribution of the personal harmonic type, the types of individuals that are within your organization. The drilling down deeper into that dashboard, not pictured here, would be the harmonic position of the institution, the histogram of it over time, how that harmonic type moves, and something we call cusp events. Who are the members in your organization that are on that bubble between the core and the participant? Wouldn't it be great to see that? You can with organizational culture harmonics. How do we engage that individual or that number of people in our organization that we want to pull into the core? You could also see, oh my gosh, we don't have enough outliers. We don't have enough people challenging our core to keep us a healthy and vibrant organization. Knowing this from a quantitative standpoint is incredibly powerful. So think of this as your organization's culture harmonic path, that annually, at least once a year, you're going out and asking people to think about themselves. Those 3 questions. It can be done that easily, or it can be the battery of 30 questions. And we can talk about that as we connect and communicate with each other. So looking at those organizational harmonic types, unlike a personality type, we believe it changes over time. We actually call these switcheroos. Remember our roos? And there are some things that we call harmonic masking. We can actually help you understand which people you can nudge toward a different role. Maybe you feel you need more keeperoos in your organization, or participation is down and you want more chipperoos, or you need to move some people around, not just as a function of type, as a function of overall culture. It's that optimal mix relative to your institutional performance that's going to create the power between your culture map and your strategic plan. Quarterly is the frequency that you should be looking at your organizational harmonic type. Every quarter or semester, however you want to think of it, you should be going out to all of the members of your organization and asking them, what do you think of our culture? Again, it's 3 questions. It's not going to take them a lot of time. Are they looking at the organization as emotional or logical? What you'll see there are some trends. Are we too holistic? Are we not focused enough on detail? Or are we being not enough altruism in our organization, A to I? You'll see all of that in the aggregated data as you go to this dashboard. And it's literally asking people to answer 3 questions every quarter. Not that invasive whatsoever. It can be done anonymously, or it can be done by employee. None of this information should be used, of course, to punish, and it should be used to encourage. Each of these roos, each of these types has an important role in the organization. How you want to compare that to your strategic planning, some organizations do this literally more than once a year. Some of them have annual strategic plans, some 3, some 5 years. That's up to you. But what you'll be looking for is, what was our position of our organization on that range of consonance to dissonance relative to our performance. Wow, that was a great quarter. Where were we with our organizational culture? Or that was a wonderful semester. Let's take a look at our culture data, looking for those shifts in distribution of your personal harmonic types, the organizational harmonic changes in dimension, those historic positions. From this, you can look at those cusp events. How many people were you able to move into the core of the organization? Or were you at a tipping point where, wow, why do we have so many outliers all of a sudden? That's all going to be indicated by this dashboard. Exciting stuff, right? And I don't like the word exciting, but it takes a lot to get me excited. And this, to me, is extremely motivational. Having been a leader for over 3 decades at the highest level in educational institutions and trying to serve students in our community and running a business as I have before that and after that, culture mapping was something that I knew we needed to quantify. And that's why we created this company. That's why we created this product, is that you have something that will quantify your culture, that you can track your culture, you can map your culture, you can plot those gaps, and you can plan those harmonic responses. You can think of it as qualitative data in a quantitative format, however you want to think of it. It's the kind of data that you should be aligning with your performance. So when I think about the assumptions, values, and celebrations of an organization, and we think about their strategy, their goals, their objectives, and their methods, it's the combination. It's not that culture is more powerful than strategy or vice versa. It's the two cannot exist in the absence of each other. Knowing where you're going, but not knowing how to optimize your energy to get there is going to put you at a competitive disadvantage. This is the power of organizational culture harmonics. It's introducing us to a new data set, a new world in this realm of predictive analytics and machine learning and artificial intelligence, where we're better understanding the people that are part of our organizations, because people are loyal to that culture more so than that strategy. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of organizational culture harmonics and this introduction into culture mapping. And I would encourage you to go out and take a look at the website, www.cultureharmonics.com. There's so much more information out there, and some deeper articles on the organization types, the personal harmonic types, a whole different set of tools that we have now that are available. The book is on Amazon, The Herd, How to Leverage the Absolute Power of Organizational Culture. And remember that it's the combination of strategy and culture that give you the best opportunity to achieve the mission and vision of your organization. And that's something that we all want to support. Again, I'm Dr. Donovan. It's been a pleasure, and feel free to contact me if you have any further questions, either through the website or my personal email, sdonovan@gmail.com. It's been a joy, and I look forward to connecting with you. Thank you so much.